familiar profile of Mount Tom rises out of the Connecticut River Basin at Holyoke. It has a long and fascinating history as a recreation area, and while the old amusement park, ski tows and wave pool, and prior to that, the summit houses and electric tramway that carried visitors up the mountainside are all long gone, Mount Tom still offers a wonderful opportunity for day trips, picnicking, hiking, scenic views of the surrounding Connecticut River Valley and the Berkshires, and of course one of the most stunning hikes in southern New England, along the basalt cliffs that form the mountain's western edge. These rocks tell a fascinating geologic history as well, of volcanic eruptions, dinosaurs, drifting continents, glaciers, a massive ancient lake, and the fertile river valley we see today. So come along as we climb to the top of one of the gems of the Connecticut Valley and explore the faces of Mount Tom. The Connecticut River Valley is a long, narrow, lowland area that you might think, as its name suggests, to be a valley formed over many years by the broad river that defines the landscape as we know it today. But the hills surrounding the valley, and especially those along its western boundary, known as the Metacomet Ridge, bear clues to a much more complex explanation and a history that long predates the rolling hills and rich floodplains of the Connecticut River watershed. A hike up Mount Tom that takes time to stop and investigate the trove of such clues along the way provides an enjoyable way to learn about the geologic history of the valley and of the familiar natural landmarks that contribute so much to the remarkable beauty of the area. The valley as we know it today began over 200 million years ago, when the crustal plates that formed the massive ancient continent of Pangaea began to pull apart. A large fault formed along a line that ran from what is now New Haven, Connecticut, northward to Keene, New Hampshire. Fissures opened in the bedrock below the ancient valley floor, allowing magma to rise to the surface and overspread the accumulated sediments in a series of flows that subsequently hardened into deep layers of basalt rock. As the magma rose to the surface, the bedrock crust dropped, and the whole valley floor west of the fault line dipped downward. The bedrock to the east of the fault line was forced upward and rose to form a tall mountain range along the fault. The hills that run northward from Stafford, Connecticut, up through Munson, Brimfield, Warren, and on up to Monadnock are remnants of those ancient mountains. As the plate shifting subsided, new sediments washed down out of the mountains into the Rift Valley, leaving large deposits of gravel, sand, and clay. The many gravel banks found in the area along the fault just east of here are deposits of this ancient outwash. The finer sediments were carried further into the lowland, forming large deposits of sandstone and shale, most notably here in East Longmeadow. This occurred during the Jurassic period in geologic history, the age of the dinosaurs, and there are numerous areas of dinosaur tracks visible in the exposed shales along the banks of the river at Holyoke, as well as at Granby, Mass. And Rocky Hill, Connecticut, and there are traces of fossil plants and small reptilian ancestors in the sandstones and shales of East Longmeadow. These hardened sediments are the first rocks we'll take a look at as we head up the mountain, and a bit later on we'll show you the area of dinosaur tracks along Route 5 just south of Holyoke. But for now, we'll begin here on Route 141, heading west toward East Hampton. Most people are probably familiar with the entrance to the Mount Tom State Reservation just across from the Log Cabin Banquet House, but we're going to pick up the trail south of the entrance and follow it up the steep southern slope. So we park in one of a number of gravel turnoffs at the side of the road and take one of the paths up toward the Metacomet Monadnock Trail. Now right along this section of the trail is a beautiful undergrowth of mountain laurel, which grasses in bloom is really quite a spectacle to come through here. Now, not far along here, just after we've turned onto the main trail, we see this ridge on the right, about 12 or 15 feet high. And up here ahead is this little path that leads us up to the top, so I'm just going to climb up and we'll take a look. Up here at the top, we're looking toward the east, and you can see that the land generally slopes away gently, and over there, through the trees, appears to be a wall of rock running from this ridge that we're on down the slope to the east through the woods. And the rock is actually split into layers, and the layers follow the gentle slope of the ground. These layers mean, of course, that these are sedimentary rocks, formed from the layers of sand and mud that settled in the pools and swamps of the ancient valley floor. And under these layers are one or more layers of the volcanic rock that rose as lava through the fissures in the valley as the Earth's crust pulled apart along the eastern continental boundary. In places here, this basalt layer is 400 to 600 feet thick. Beneath that are even older sediments, and then the harder bedrock foundation of gneiss, which, along with granite, forms virtually all the other hills and mountains of New England outside of the Connecticut Valley. Now, notice the angle of the slope here. These are layers of rock that were originally deposited as sediments over a broad, flat expanse of land. And if you recall the map we saw earlier of Pangaea, the Connecticut Valley used to be, when all this land forming was happening, down about 8 degrees north of the equator. So it was a very different landscape then. And when the bottom fell out, so to speak, and the underlying crust dropped along that eastern fault line, all of these flat layers tipped up like a cake that was collapsed to one side. So we're looking north at this exposed face of rock, and I want to show you again the photo from one of the sandstone quarries in East Long Meadow, 15 or so miles to the south and east of here, also looking north, that shows the almost identical angle in the sandstone formation being quarried there. And it's a rather astonishing comparison that allows you to visualize this immense flat slab of the Earth's crust that tilted along the entire length of the Connecticut Valley. Now here's a spot in the trail, not far along, where this shale-like rock is exposed. Notice the reddish-brown color. This is the same rock, of approximately the same age, that you'd find in East Long Meadow and actually throughout the valley. And I just want to point it out here and note that it's tilted out of the ground at the same angle as the rocks we just looked at in the woods. And as we get farther up the trail, you'll be able to see a very abrupt change in what's underfoot. And also to remind you how easily this wears away, so that erosion and glacial scouring have removed most of these sedimentary layers on most of the upper part of the mountain and exposed the harder volcanic rock underneath, as we'll soon see. So further along, we've come across another much larger exposed face of rock, visible through the woods there to the right. I'll take a shortcut up here that will lead right up to the edge of this cliff that rises a good 40 to 50 feet out of the steep hillside. and the hill drops away quite steeply here to my right. This cliff face shows very clearly and quite beautifully the way these sediments were deposited over millennia and the way the material that was washed into the very ancient valley varied throughout different periods and conditions. There are layers of silt and mud here fractions of an inch thick, interspersed with beds of lighter colored sandstone that are over 2 feet thick in places. The softer, more fragile rock has eroded in these undulating curves. The harder stone has cleaved off in somewhat more angular chunks as it's been undermined by the softer layers eroding away beneath it. That process continues even now, with groundwater flowing through these layers, washing them away grain by grain, freezing and expanding in winter so that even bigger pieces break away. This cliff face is a cross-section of the very ancient Earth. It's a natural timeline of the slow processes and complex interactions that occur in front of us every day. With the exception of volcanic eruptions and earthquakes, what we mark as events in geologic history often happened over thousands or even millions of years, at a pace that is virtually impossible to observe from the scale of a human lifetime. The last North American ice sheet reached as far south as what is now Long Island. It was up to a mile thick in many areas of New England, and its weight caused additional movement of the underlying crust, pushing some areas, particularly the rift valleys, below sea level, and creating dozens of secondary faults in the underlying bedrock. As the glacier moved south, it scoured the underlying mountains of their softer sedimentary layers, and typically broke large chunks of rock off of south-facing slopes in a process called plucking, carrying the debris further south and leaving a series of these prominent, steep-faced peaks as far south as New Haven. Then, as the glacier retreated northward, two things happened. Material deposited in the valley at Rocky Hill, Connecticut, dammed meltwater flowing from the glacier itself, so that in time the entire valley was filled by a huge glacial lake that geologists named Lake Hitchcock. It extended from Connecticut to Vermont, spread from West Hampton to the Pelham Upland, and it left Mount Tom an island. Second, the whole New England landscape, relieved of the weight of glacial ice, gradually rose again in a process called isostatic uplift. Currents in the lake bottom, following the old riverbed, began to flow again. Mountain streams carried new sediments into the lake bed, aided by the wind and ice that continued to break apart the older rocks and sediments that remained above the lake's rim. This cliff, like the larger cliffs higher up the peak, may well be the result of this southern slope having been broken off by glacial ice, and it may later have stood at the shoreline of Lake Hitchcock as it ran westward around Mount Tom into the East Hampton Valley. All right, we've made our way up to the top of that cliff now, and here's another large bit of that same red shale. Again, this looks familiar to anyone in East Longmeadow who has come across this, digging or rebuilding old stone walls. There's always some chunks of this that crumble apart or cleave into flat slabs very easily. It's all over the valley. What made the quarrying industry in East Longmeadow possible was not this stuff, but the adjacent large, uniform deposits of sandstone, similarly colored but composed and structured differently. The program Bruce Moore did on the history of quarrying in East Longmeadow shows, through old photographs, the way the consistency of these deposits really defined the history of the industry in town. So we're heading due north now along this plateau, and the rocks on the path look the same as they have so far. To the east, the land slopes away gently through the woods, and there are trails that lead off that way that would take you around to the eastern side of the mountain, past the Trap Rock Quarry, the old railway cuts, and a memorial to a crew of 25 who perished when a B-17 out of Westover Air Force Base crashed into the mountainside in 1946. And now, as the mountainside rises ahead of us through the woods, we abruptly find ourselves on a path covered with these angular pieces of a very different type of rock. These are pieces of volcanic basalt, shards of that layer of molten lava that erupted out of cracks and fissures and overspread the ancient valley floor. And here we've reached a point where that tipped layer of this flopped cake we've been climbing has been exposed by glacier and erosion, and then broken to bits by the forces of weathering, ice, and certainly here by the tread of feet and tips of hiking sticks. This broken stone is called talus, T-A-L-U-S, and all along the basalt ridge that forms the western boundary of the Connecticut Valley, there are broad slopes of it at the base of the cliffs from which it falls.
Now, as we're climbing up this steep, crumbly trail, and you can hear the rocks sliding underfoot, probably worth a note of caution. The rocks are slippery. And you do need to be careful. Just take a glance down here, and this is a nice example, right in the middle of the trail, of where these basalt chunks come from. So this is looking, straight down, and you notice the way the surface is fractured into these patterns, and it's those vertical fractures that extend down through the volcanic rock that cause it to break off into these faceted chunks, like so. And we'll see more of that in a much more spectacular fashion up on the mountain. So we're getting pretty close, not to the top, but to where the trees are shortened back. Here's where an anchor to one of the power poles cuts across the trail, to marked with a piece of pink tape, so you don't want to get clobbered there.
So here's a nice opening in the trees just above the park entrance, and a glimpse out to the southwest toward Southwick and Granby, Connecticut. And then a few feet on, another lookout and a steep descent to the entrance road at the main gate. That's Barnes Airport to the far left, just above the trees. And turning here to the right, we see the first of these large broken rock faces, protected here a little bit by the trees, and completely unlike those first exposed rock faces we saw lower down the mountain in the woods. Where those rock layers formed horizontally over millennia, this rock shows the distinctive pattern of close vertical fractures and irregular, slightly curved planes that formed within the structure of the molten rock as it cooled. What it does have in common with that lower cliff face is the way the glaciers tore apart the mountainside and left both of them exposed. Now we're just below the summit, and here the terrain levels out slightly as we come to another opening on the left that will follow out onto the ledge and get our first idea of the scale and beauty of these broken rock faces of Mount Tom. These cliffs are unique to the Metacomet Ridge, and here at Mount Tom, they're awesomely beautiful in their form and their color, and for the commanding prospect they provide of the surrounding western Massachusetts landscape. To be here on a beautiful morning like this gives you an opportunity to just marvel at the scale of time and the power of the forces that have shaped this landscape over thousands and thousands of years. We're just below the summit now, and there, overhead, are some of the communications towers that are so prominent on this rocky peak of Mount Tom. The trail narrows as we squeeze between the rocks on one side and the cliff on the other.
Now as we come up around the top, and a set of old concrete steps, the remains of a former summit house that was built. Actually, there were a couple of them built here over the years. Obviously, all disintegrated. Here's a foundation of one of them right here on the corner. Now completely inundated with communications equipment.
This hotel, until it burned in 1929, was a popular spot, and people could take the electric tram up the east slope to a station just over the peak from here and enjoy lunch in the restaurant and lodge in the hotel and walk along this walkway and take in the wonderful view. From here, we can look south along the Metacomet Ridge, which extends as far as the eye can see down into Connecticut. And the mountains that form it share an astonishingly obvious similarity from this perspective as they slope gently up from the valley to the east and then drop off abruptly to the west. It really is possible, looking well down past Hartford here toward the hanging hills of Meriden, to see this great tilt of the underlying rock jutting up out of the fertile sediments of the river valley. Along its entire length are more of these exposed basalt cliffs and talus slopes, and the Metacomet Trail pretty much follows it for most of its length. To the west of this ridge, beyond Westfield, are the low rolling hills of Tolland, Blandford, and beyond them the Berkshires, those massive old bedrock hills that are the remnants of still older mountain ranges, pushed up out of the earth too and eroded and scoured as the Metacomet Ridge was by successive glaciers. But here, on the lip of this basalt sheet, it's as if you're standing at the stern rail of this titanic sunken slab of the ancient valley, and you can sense its immensity and imagine its extent below the earth. At 1,202 feet, Mount Tom is not on any scale an impressive peak, but it conveys a magnificent geologic story that's unique to the Connecticut River Valley we call home. The remnants of this walk that led from the upper station of the tramway are crumbling away, bordered here by scrub and wildflowers. And a little further on, we can stop and see below us to the right the paved service road that follows the old railroad line up the long eastern slope from the old mountain park. And from here we can also look to the northeast, toward Mount Holyoke and Mount Norwottuck, which, like Mount Tom, are part of the basalt sheet that was tilted up out of the ancient valley, broken by successive faults and scoured by glacial ice. The Metacomet-Monadnock Trail we are on eventually leads across the Holyoke Range, but from here we're going to first go along the western edge of Mount Tom. And so we'll follow this blaze here down through the woods and into this sweet little glade where we see, through the open trees, a view off to the west. And from there we'll follow the trail for about a mile along the cliffs, turning intermittently down into these wooded glens and then out again along the ridge. The varying microclimates here support an amazing variety of sometimes familiar plants. Over 3/4 of all New England's native plant species have been found on this mountain. The continual change from forest to alpine to desert-like landscapes against the backdrop of the valley below is one of the great charms of this hike. Less charming is the graffiti, which appears everywhere underfoot, messages out of a spray can imposed with artless self-indulgence on the subtle textures and colors of the natural landscape. These surface colors are caused by the oxidation of iron compounds in the rock where they're exposed. The actual color of this basalt rock is a medium neutral gray, and you can pick up a chunk that will split easily in half to reveal the intrinsic absence of color on the inside. It's the light and the air and the atmosphere that give color to these richly textured palisades. Color that ranges from deep violet to brilliant orange on any given day. Color that shifts with the weather and the angle of the sun as it plays across the rhythms of these broken surfaces. These are forms that intrigue an artist, drawn to the idea of transposing them onto a little bit of canvas with pigments of the same ochres and oxides that color the rocks in front of him. Such a painter could be easily convinced that forms like these must have revealed to Cézanne, Braque, and Picasso a natural structure that they then transposed to form the basis of their early modern masterpieces. Now we've come to one of the most striking among the basalt formations along this ridge, an example of what's known as a pillar, formed from lava that hardened in a column as it rose through a hole or shaft in the softer surrounding earth. That softer rock was long ago eroded away, leaving the harder basalt column exposed. Immediately below us is a pile of talus spilling down the slope of the mountain. And farther down the mountain are massive, toppled upper sections of these truncated columns of rock. Two very large pieces, known as the Twin Rocks, lay adjacent to the Park Road, where their shape and bark-like texture convinced me as a young child that they were the trunks of petrified trees that had fallen in the ancient forest. We've started to descend now from the highest part of the cliff trail, and the view to the northeast opens up again. From here, the trail continues northward, gradually subsiding into woodland and then down into the park, From there, it goes up over Mount Nonotuck and down again to Route 5. Across the river, it picks up again to follow the Holyoke Range eastward, past the Summit House, visible here atop Mount Holyoke. It continues over the Notch, along Norwottuck, and then up around the eastern side of the valley, along those blue hills, to the lone gray peak of Monadnock, looming there some 60 miles away on the northern horizon. In the foreground, the towers of the University of Massachusetts sprawl across the lowlands of Amherst. A bit to the south, at Amherst College, the Benesky Museum of Natural History displays an astonishing collection of fossils, skeletons, mineral specimens, and dinosaur footprints, as well as models and paintings that illustrate the geology and natural history of the valley. And, as we noted earlier, the trustees of reservations have preserved an area south of Holyoke along Route 5, where you can see tracks, learn about the dinosaurs that once roamed the ancient valley. The area is marked with a turnoff for parking and descriptive signs at the head of the access trail.
So here we are, really at the northernmost end of these exposed cliff faces, looking north, Connecticut River Oxbow right here behind me. The trail from here continues down into the state reservation, where it leads, into the park. That's all accessible by car through the main gate across from the log cabin restaurant. So I hope you've enjoyed the hike. It's been a spectacular day to do it, and thanks for coming along. For ELCAT, I'm Don Maki.